The night was still, but he could hear it, a cry so faint, so distant, yet it echoed through his soul like a forgotten melody. It wasn't the wind, nor the rustling of leaves. It was something else, something hidden beneath the silence of the world. He had spent years trying to forget, to bury the past under layers of time. But some cries never fade. Some voices refuse to be silenced. And under the moon's cold glow, he would finally have to listen. The air was thick with silence, but it wasn't empty. It carried something unseen, something waiting. He stood still under the pale glow of the moon, staring at the house he had once called home. Time had not touched it. It remained as he had left it, frozen in the past. Yet something felt different. The whispers that once hid in the shadows had grown stronger, weaving through the night like an invisible thread pulling him closer. His fingers twitched at his sides. He had spent years avoiding this place, convincing himself that the memories buried here would stay buried. But now the past was calling. No, not calling, crying. A chill ran down his spine. He exhaled slowly, watching his breath vanish into the cold air. The sound was distant at first, like a sob muffled by the wind. But the longer he stood there, the clearer it became.
A cry.
Faint, yet persistent. His feet moved before his mind could stop them. Each step toward the house felt heavier, as if something unseen pressed against him, resisting his approach. The wooden porch groaned under his weight, the sound cutting through the night. His hand hovered over the doorknob, hesitating. A deep breath. He turned it. The door creaked open, revealing darkness. The air inside was thick, stale, untouched by life. He stepped forward, and the old wooden floorboards creaked beneath his weight. The scent of dust and forgotten memories clung to the walls. The living room was just as he remembered, except for one thing. The crying was louder here. His pulse quickened. He scanned the room, his eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through the broken window. Furniture draped in white sheets loomed like ghosts in the darkness. The fireplace was cold, its embers long dead. Everything was still, except for the sound. It was coming from upstairs. His fingers curled into fists. He should leave, turn around, and walk away. But something deeper, something beyond logic, pulled him forward. One step, then another. The old staircase groaned beneath his feet as he climbed, his breath shallow. The crying didn't stop. It didn't fade. It was waiting. He reached the second floor. The hallway stretched before him, lined with closed doors. The walls bore faint stains of time, and the air was colder here, as if the house itself had drawn in a breath and refused to exhale. His eyes landed on the last door at the end of the hall. It was slightly open. The crying came from within. His hand trembled as he reached for the handle. His mind screamed at him to stop, to turn back. But his heart whispered otherwise. He pushed the door open. The room was small, untouched by time. A single bed sat against the far wall, covered in dust. The curtains swayed lightly, though there was no wind. But it was the chair in the corner that sent ice through his veins. It rocked.
Slowly.
Methodically, as if someone was sitting there. And then the crying stopped. The silence was deafening. His breath came out in uneven gasps, his pulse roaring in his ears. He wanted to step forward to reach out to what he didn't know, but he couldn't move. Then, from the corner of the room, a whisper.
Soft. Faint.
Calling his name. The chair creaked. His throat tightened. He wasn't alone. A shadow shifted just beyond the moonlight's reach, something barely visible, yet unmistakably there. The whisper came again, more urgent this time. He took a step back, his heart slamming against his ribs. His mind struggled to make sense of what he was seeing, of what he was hearing. But then, something colder than fear settled over him.
The cry.
The whisper. They weren't unfamiliar. They had always been here. And deep down, he had always known. A sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut behind him. And the past reached out to claim him. You said. The door slammed shut behind him, sealing the room in suffocating darkness. His breath hitched, his pulse hammering in his ears. The air was thick, pressing against his skin, against his lungs. He tried to move, but something in the room had shifted, something unseen, something waiting. The rocking chair had stopped. The whisper came again.
Soft.
Urgent.
Close.
He swallowed hard. His fingers twitched at his sides, his entire body frozen between fight and flight. But where would he run? The door was shut, and the presence in the room wasn't letting him go. The whisper called his name. He turned slowly, his vision adjusting to the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the curtains. The chair sat still in the corner, but the air around it shimmered, like heat rising from pavement. He wasn't imagining this. Something was here, and it knew him. His fingers curled into fists. His throat tightened as he forced himself to speak. "Who are you?" Silence. Then, a faint creak of wood, like someone shifting their weight. He stepped forward, his breath shallow, his mind screaming at him to stop. But he had come too far. The whispers had led him here. The crying had drawn him back. He had to know. He reached out. The air turned ice cold, wrapping around his fingers like unseen hands. His breath came out in a shaky cloud, visible in the dim light. Then a voice, clearer this time, fragile and aching. "You left me." A chill shot through his spine. The voice was familiar. His breath stilled. His fingers trembled. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "I didn't." The air thickened. The rocking chair groaned. The presence in the room grew heavier. "Yes, you did," the voice whispered back. Something moved in the shadows. A shape, a figure. Too faint to make out, but there. His chest ached. He tried to force air into his lungs, but it felt like the room itself was pressing down on him. "I don't understand," he choked out. The voice didn't answer right away. The silence stretched, growing heavier with each second. Then, the figure in the corner shifted. A slow, deliberate movement, stepping into the pale moonlight. His breath caught. A girl. Her face was obscured, her form flickering like a dying flame. But there was something painfully familiar about her, something that clawed at his memories, forcing them to surface. He took a step back. "No," he whispered. The girl's head tilted slightly. Her voice was barely audible, yet it cut through him like a blade. "You promised you wouldn't forget." His knees nearly buckled. A surge of memories, long buried, crashed into him all at once. A childhood promise. A hand slipping from his grasp. A night just like this one. And a cry that had never stopped. His pulse thundered. "You're not real," he gasped. The girl took another step forward. The air around her shimmered, cold and restless. "Neither is your silence," she whispered. The wind outside howled, rattling the window panes. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in. He clenched his fists, trying to ground himself, to stop his mind from spinning. "I didn't leave you," he insisted, his voice shaking. The girl lifted her head. He could almost see her eyes, deep, hollow, filled with something that made his stomach twist. "Then why am I still here?" His throat closed. The weight of her words crushed him. She was here because of him, because of his silence, because of the promise he had broken. His vision blurred, his chest tightening. His voice cracked. "I tried to forget." The girl's form flickered. The air turned colder. "I never did." The window behind her shattered. The wind roared through the room, and the whisper grew louder. Not just one voice now. Many. Echoing. Calling. Demanding. The girl lifted her hand, reaching toward him. And he realized, this wasn't just a haunting. This was a reckoning. The past wasn't done with him yet. The wind howled through the shattered window, carrying whispers that curled around him like unseen hands. The room pulsed with something alive, something unseen yet impossible to ignore. His breath came in uneven gasps as the girl stood before him, her presence flickering like a dying candle, caught between this world and something beyond. The voices surrounded him, not just hers anymore, many. Layers of whispers, fragmented cries, overlapping, pressing against his skull. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block them out, but they burrowed deeper, weaving into his thoughts like tangled threads. "You never came back." The girl's voice cut through the others, clear, steady, and full of sorrow. His eyes snapped open. I didn't know how, he choked out. His own voice felt distant, unfamiliar. I thought, he swallowed hard. I thought forgetting would help. The wind stilled. The room exhaled. The girl didn't move. Her expression didn't change. But the air between them tightened, as if the space itself had become something solid, trapping him within it. He took a step back, his body tense, his fingers twitching at his sides. The door was behind him. He could run. He should run. But his feet wouldn't move. Because deep down he knew this was never about leaving. It was about listening. The whispering faded to a low hum, a steady rhythm against the silence. The girl's form wavered, shifting between solid and shadow. Who are you? His voice barely rose above the quiet. The girl tilted her head. The moonlight touched her face, revealing features that sent a sharp pain through his chest. He knew her. Not as a ghost. Not as a shadow. As someone real. A memory buried beneath years of silence, hidden away in the deepest parts of his mind where he thought it would never surface again.
But it was here now.
She was here now. And she was waiting. A lump formed in his throat. I don't, his voice cracked. I don't remember your name. The girl's gaze didn't waver. You do, she whispered. The moment she said it, something shifted. A crack in his mind. A sliver of light piercing through years of darkness. A flash of laughter in the summer air. The warmth of a small hand in his own. The sound of her voice calling his name, before everything changed. The floor beneath him trembled. The house was reacting, like a living thing responding to the memory clawing its way back to the surface. His knees felt weak. His breath came out in short, uneven bursts. I left you. The words slipped out before he could stop them. The girl's expression didn't change. She didn't need to confirm it. He knew. A sob built in his throat, raw and suffocating. It was an accident. The whispering surged again, rising like a tide. You left me, she repeated. His chest tightened. It was true. The accident. The storm. The night he had run when he should have stayed. And she had been trapped here ever since. His legs shook. He dropped to his knees, the weight of it all too much. His head fell forward, and his fingers dug into the floor as if anchoring himself to something real, something solid. I didn't mean to, he whispered. The girl took a step forward. The wind outside softened. The other voices dimmed. She was the only one left now. Her voice was no longer accusing, no longer bitter, just tired. I waited for you. Tears burned his eyes. I know. Silence stretched between them. The walls of the house trembled. The floor creaked beneath him. The air shifted, no longer pressing against his skin but lifting, like an unseen weight had begun to fade. The girl's form flickered. For the first time, her gaze softened. You can let go now, she whispered. His heart clenched. And if I don't? She smiled. Not a sad smile. Not a haunting one. Just peace. Then I will. The wind exhaled. The whispers fell away. And the girl began to fade. His chest ached, as if something inside him was unraveling, leaving space where guilt had once been. He wanted to reach out, wanted to stop her. But he knew this was what she had been waiting for. Not revenge. Not an apology. Just release. The last thing he saw before she disappeared completely was her eyes, no longer filled with sorrow, but something else. Something lighter. Something free. Then she was gone. And for the first time in years, the house was silent. The silence in the house was unlike any he had ever experienced. It wasn't empty, it was final. The air, once thick with whispers and unseen hands pulling him back, now felt light, weightless, as if the house itself had exhaled for the first time in years. He remained on his knees, staring at the spot where she had stood. The dust in the air settled, and the cold that had gripped his skin slowly faded. He let out a shaky breath, pressing his palms against the floor to steady himself. She was gone. Not in the way she had been before, a trapped presence lingering between two worlds. She was free. His fingers curled into the floor, his nails digging into the old wood. The realization settled deep into his bones, heavier than anything he had ever carried. For so long, he had lived with a shadow following him, a weight he had ignored, pretending it wasn't there. But the whispers had never been a curse. They had been a cry. And now that cry had ended. He pushed himself up, his legs weak, his breaths uneven. He turned toward the door, half expecting it to remain shut like before, trapping him in the past. But this time, the handle turned easily beneath his fingers. The door creaked open. The hallway stretched before him, the moonlight spilling through the broken windows, illuminating dust particles floating in the air. It felt different. Lighter. The house had changed. No, he had changed. His feet carried him down the staircase, each step steady, certain. There was no hesitation, no fear, no whispers creeping along the walls, pulling him back. The house had held on to him for so long, refusing to let him forget. But now it was letting him go. He stepped outside. The wind was softer now, brushing against his skin with the crisp scent of the night. The clouds had parted, revealing a sky full of stars. For the first time, the house stood behind him, not as a looming shadow, but simply a house, just wood and stone and memories. Nothing more. His fingers twitched at his sides. He felt the urge to look back, to let his gaze linger one last time. But he didn't, because looking back meant holding on. And she had let go. It was time for him to do the same. The dirt path leading away from the house felt unfamiliar beneath his feet. It had always been there, yet it had never been his to walk before.
Now it was.
As he reached the edge of the property, he paused. The wind shifted, wrapping around him, carrying a sound so faint he could have mistaken it for the breeze. A whisper. But this time it wasn't a plea. It wasn't sorrow. It was a goodbye. And with that, he stepped forward, leaving the past behind. The road stretched before him, open and endless, yet each step forward felt lighter than the last. For the first time in years, the weight pressing against his chest had lifted, the whispers had faded, and the silence was no longer suffocating. He had expected to feel lost without them, without the presence that had followed him for so long. Instead, he felt something unfamiliar, peace. The night air carried the scent of damp earth and distant rain, but it no longer felt heavy. The wind no longer whispered secrets in his ears. The past no longer clawed at his heels. He walked with no urgency, no fear, just the quiet understanding that he had finally left it behind. But leaving didn't mean forgetting. His fingers traced the edge of his jacket pocket, where an old, folded photograph rested. He hadn't dared look at it in years. He wasn't sure why he had brought it with him, why it had remained in the depths of his belongings even after all this time. Now, it felt like a part of the closure he had never known he needed. His fingers trembled slightly as he unfolded it. The image was faded, edges worn from time. Two children stood in the sunlit yard of the very house he had just left behind. A boy with messy hair and a mischievous grin, his arm draped over the shoulders of a girl who mirrored him in every way except for her smile, softer, quieter, filled with something deeper than playfulness. He had forgotten how much she used to smile. His throat tightened. For so many years, all he had remembered was her absence, her whispers, her pain. But now, as he stared at the picture, he remembered something else. She had lived before she had been lost. She had laughed. She had run barefoot through the grass, tugging at his sleeve, challenging him to race her to the tree line. She had existed before the silence. And that was what he needed to hold on to. Not the guilt, not the sorrow, but her. The wind stirred around him, soft, almost warm. A gentle presence, not lingering, not clinging, just passing through. A whisper, not of longing, but of farewell. He exhaled, the breath shaky, but sure. He folded the photograph carefully, placing it back where it belonged, not as a reminder of loss, but of love. The town lights flickered in the distance. A world that had continued moving, even when he had been stuck in the past. He had spent so much time trapped in that house, in those memories, that he had forgotten what it meant to move forward.
But now he knew.
His feet carried him down the road, towards something new, something unknown. And for the first time, the unknown didn't terrify him. He didn't look back, because she wasn't behind him anymore. She was with him, not as a whisper, not as a shadow, but as a part of him. And this time, he was ready to let go.